And it's kind of going into, you got into a little bit with the university, but also talking about useless theory. And so in your book, because we're also like, we're interested in education, but you begin Savage Ecology by stating that this book wasn't supposed to be written. And so could you elaborate on those educational experiences and how they've informed your life and your intellectual work? Because I think that's also kind of a running undercurrent of this conversation so
Yeah.
far. So helping through
Yeah.
that.
I mean, I hated school, like having severe learning disabilities before the ADA was like a nightmare. It was a nightmare for my mom. It was a nightmare for me. Um, it was always the luck of the draw of whether or not I was going to get somebody who did their best effort to help me or somebody who just like used me as an example for the rest of the class of what an idiot was. Um, and, like I experienced a lot of sadism in school, teachers who were like offended that I seemed articulate and intelligent at one cut, that I would I put into the "you think you're so fancy, huh" category. And then incapable in writing because I'm dysgraphic and I have some other learning disabilities. So, it produced, terror. It just meant like going to school made me physically ill most days. And so it's a little weird to like end up an academic when your entire encounter with school really until you got to college was horrifying. It was awful. Um, and I mean, I think about in particular in high school, there was one moment I had a math teacher named Miss Cantu who called my mom, and my mom was like in tears, and I was like, "What's wrong, Mom?" And she was like, "Oh, your teacher just yelled at me that like you have no business being in school. Like the best thing that you could hope for is that maybe you'll finish one more year of high school, and that I should really start looking for like a remedial program for you, like something like you can learn a trade. And not that there's anything wrong with learning a trade, but like you know." This is my sophomore year. Like I already read Critique of Pure Reason, and I'd like gotten all the other cool books I could find at the library that were about philosophy. Like that's not what I wanted, like that's not where I was going. And, it seemed like school was going to be a dead end. And so that was an experience of homogenization. I couldn't produce knowledge back, right? Like that sort of banking model of education. I couldn't produce the other side of that currency exchange in the way that they wanted me to. In part because I literally physically couldn't write, and they wouldn't let me use a computer in the classroom because that was cheating. And I remember I wrote our junior year of high school. We had to write our first like serious research paper, and I wrote it on Bakunin and Ayn Rand, and why Ayn Rand misunderstood the concept of freedom, and why I thought Bakunin, had it kind of nailed, and like where that sort of misunderstanding was between libertarianism and anarchism, and like why I thought Rand would always end up in this strangely authoritarian place, right? Even though, right, it was a desire to escape the state. I thought that was pretty cool for a junior in high school. I turned in this paper. It was 32 pages long. My mom weirdly found a copy of it recently when she moved, which is why I'm thinking about it. And we got 2 grades back for the paper. One grade was the content grade, for which I got 100. And the other grade that the content grade was above was the grade for mechanics and grammar, and I got a minus 272. And so the teacher had basically made sure that my paper failed, right? Like there was no way for the content to exceed the mechanics. There's just nothing I could do, right? I literally, and it like, if you're going to give someone a minus 272, like giving them the 100 is really just spite, right? It's to say, you thought you had this, but you will never like dig yourself up out of this problem. And, it's hard not to see the way that the emergence of American education after World War II is this sort of like, what's it supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be this cauldron where we learn how to separate winners and losers, and where teachers are in some sense rewarded for finding the best of the best, and then taught to bemoan when they have to manage those who are not right in that class. And so, like, it was definitely my first encounter with the Euroscene, but I think it's an essential part of the Euroscene. I think education is one of those ways where we reproduce those forms. And I mean that in a kind of like Whiteheadian and Deleuzian sense, right? Because they're incredibly plastic forms. So yes, they can go directly into capital, but they also find their ways directly into domestic violence. They find their ways into racial profiling, right? Those logics of organizing difference and creating value. I think we start that pedagogy like basically the first day of kindergarten, you know? I remember like even in kindergarten, there were reading groups and everyone knew, like even at the age of 5, everyone knew, right? Like the butterfly group was better than the donkey group, right? And it had to do with how well you could read, right?
Clearly, clearly,
yeah, clear,
clearly the butterfly group is better, definitely.
yeah, right. But I'm already saying like what's amazing is like I had a great like I had a great teacher in kindergarten. You know, I'm sure she just inherited that from like whoever had done her bulletin board, you know, the year before. But so like for me, theory is always pedagogy. Because for me, pedagogy is where violence reproduces itself, and it's also where critical tools come in. And so, you know, it was the couple of good teachers who said, this stuff you can't do. I only want to see this stuff from you. And they knew why they were doing it, right? You know, like one of them because their son had pretty severe dyslexia. One of them just because he thought it was hilarious that I was reading Scientific American like in junior high, and you know I was a super science nerd, and so instead of like giving me exams in the same way, he would be like, "You're teaching class today on recombinant DNA." He's like, "I saw you reading that," you know, and then you know like I felt like $1,000,000 until I got to the next class, right? Those kinds of moments of pedagogy too, right? Like those are the ones that make you think, you know, screw all the rest of the teachers. I'm going to college and I'll find some of the things. And then, you know, you bump into some of those same jerks in college too. But like there's something amazing that happens when you get to the university and there's still some people around that care about ideas. And they haven't been abused by the formalism of curriculum planning. And they're just sort of excited to see somebody who's as excited about ideas as they are. And so, you know, like I was lucky in that I made it through. And also I was lucky I was in a state with a land grant school where there were still ideas, right? I was in Texas. My grades were terrible. But at that time, if you scored well on the SAT, you automatically got into the university. And they had this like sliding scale. So, you know, like I think I had to get I had to get a minimum score of a 1490, which was like only 100 points away from perfect on the SAT to even get in with my grade point average. But, you know, like whatever, I pulled off the score, you know, and there are all sorts of reasons I'm sure like I can access standardized tests in a way that others couldn't. But for whatever reason, like that didn't resonate with my learning disability in a negative way. But then once I got there, that like the university seemed like just this like wholly other space. And I think that had a lot to do with why I have, you know, I mean, a kind of romantic view of what the university can be as a kind of refuge, you know, because like in Texas, again, UT Austin isn't just like a refuge for ideas. It's like also a refuge for justice. It's like, you know, like it was so much less conservative than everywhere else, you know, like it could be this place where we could experiment with music and we could experiment with ideas and you could come across weird books you weren't supposed to read and, you know, find yourself into strange conversations with people. And so, you know, and it was public, right? It was like something that, you know, I could figure out how to afford. It was $1,200 a semester when I went to UT, and that was only 20 years ago. You know, like that like was something valuable. And so I, you know, from that, I think I inherit a kind of sense that, you know, for all of its problems, right? There were tons of problems there too, but, you know, there's something about the university and there's something about it being made accessible and wild, right? Not, you know, the other thing about UT is it's enormous. It's 60,000 people. Like nobody could impose a vision of what UT was supposed to be on UT, like if you had an army, you know? And those things mattered, right? And I think those were really formative for me, for sure.
And then going to that, 'cause I like how you pointed to, like, there is how the martial ecology is already infused in those in curriculum, especially when it tries to forces you to be certain people or like whoever this like ideal student is. But also you point to the refuge of the university and having that. And so you also stated that to study the world as it is a means to care for it. and being in the world, and you affirm a type of freedom in the useless study or forms of thought that have no immediate application, right? Or it's just like areas you said wild. So I'm curious for you, how do you see uselessness as affirmative and generative, or adding to the spaces, and can we find resistance in uselessness? And especially where can this emerge, especially right now, like how the university is today?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the only thing that you can do if you want to push back. What's amazing to me, like, I mean, everybody who teaches university knows this, like you always have a dean on your back that's like, please produce value. How are you going to produce value today for the university? And the irony is, like, if you say, well, actually, I don't want to do that, I want to do this, they'll be like, oh, we can make that into value. Right? So like remarkable, like they'll even do the work for you. Like if you don't figure out how to create value out of it, they'll figure out how to create value out of it. And so at a certain point in time, I just want to be like, well, actually, I'm going to work on being useless. I'm like devoting myself to doing things that you can't make value out of. It was the best way I could figure out how to draw a line in the sand, which is, I think, easier in some sense in fields that have been written off, right? So in creative writing, for instance, like, like it's not that they won't try to create value out of it, but like they're the first thing that people make fun of, in the neoliberal university. Why do we have creative writing programs? Who's going to be doing any of that? Unless they're making film, right? We can make movies or TV shows out of it. But in political science, it's just sort of given. You're going to produce reports that are good for things, right? Like you're going to produce reports on how to make the economy better, how to, make democratic voting more efficient, like it's just like, it's all about use value. And I wanted there to be some part, there's that line in 1,000 Plateaus where they say, you've got to hold on to a little plot of land just for yourself. Right? This is what they call the refrain. The refrain is that tune that a kid whistles to themselves so they don't forget who they are. I wanted a little space where what I did wasn't for something else. And I mean, we do that all the time. There's a guitar hanging behind Alex. My guess is he's not monetizing whatever he plays on it on Spotify. Like if he's like me, like the reason you sit around and play the guitar is it's just satisfying. Like even when it's frustrating, it's like satisfying to play, and it has no value. And there I was reaching this point, and it's why I actually spent a large portion of COVID hanging out with chickens and building a guitar out of a monkey pod tree from down the street. But there was a point in my career where I couldn't even read a novel without thinking, oh, this could be a great introduction to an article. Maybe actually I could turn this into a theory. Maybe this is an example I could make. Like I couldn't sit through a TV show with my kids or like a movie with my kids without being like, oh wow, what a great example of the way that ... which felt commanding in all of the wrong ways, right? Like it seemed like the death of freedom. I think about this a lot with like, we have these like Althusserian moments where we're hailed right into the old ISA. Which I love, by the way, that our yearly conference is already called the ISA, the International Studies Association, because then I can just think it's just the ideological state apparatus. But they have like T-shirts, they're like ISA 2020. Like what I was losing, right? Like that, we've talked about this in class and reading group, and we had it, Amy, where literacy becomes a kind of automated system. You can't look at a text without reading it. It's almost impossible. Right? When you're this embedded as we are in literacy, like you look at a text and you immediately read it. It's an automaticity. You can't appreciate the font. You can't appreciate the picture of the image, right? You just, like the words literally scream at you. They just like scream off the page. And everything was becoming that way for me, because that's what getting tenure was about, and that's what trying to succeed in a career was about. And I was like, well, fine, I can't unlearn reading, but could I get to a place where I could encounter an idea, or I could encounter a thing, and I could just encounter it for itself for like just a few seconds, right? Like where I could just encounter something. And my first sensibility wasn't, how do I cut its head off, debone it, and turn it into, chicken strips. And that's hard work. It's actually not something you make as a decision. It's something you cultivate as a practice. And so that was one of the reasons why I sent out that crazy flyer, in part because I was also getting criticism from some members of my department that I was like doing too much. Like it wasn't for my tenure, like I was doing these things that I shouldn't be doing. And more to the point, students were doing things they shouldn't be doing. So I sent out this random flyer for a reading group on useless theory, because like, how could they complain possibly that like I was impinging upon their territory or taking up students if we were, whatever we were doing, it was totally useless. Like it had no value. Don't worry. There was no credit, right? It wasn't going to help people's dissertations. It wasn't going to create like meaningful solutions for modern living. It was just like, it just was whatever it was. And, it's funny, because now I'm basically teaching a class this semester, which is premised off the reading group. We're reading one book for the entire semester. It's like 20, 40 pages of reading a week. I refuse for people to be like, well, what's this for? And I think people are really enjoying, for the first time since COVID started, just like doing a little reading and having a conversation, because it takes a while. It's uncomfortable, but you start to remember that, curiosity is a value, and just like feeling your brain make connections is a value, and like encountering the world differently because an idea slapped you upside the head is valuable. And it's not valuable in any kind of way that you can measure on an end of the year KPI report. And that's good. And it's more work. So that's the other problem, right? It is more work. It's exhausting. Having reading group every week, when I was also trying to get tenure, could be exhausting, but I got something from it, right? Which I don't think I could have gotten from something else. So, I really feel like, useless is sort of a ploy, right? Because, well, then it's useful, it brought you joy, like that's always there's always some dumbass to say that to you. But I don't actually think that's what useful means, right? Useful means exchangeable, right? And exchangeability often requires homogenization, right? Not singularity, right? It has to have an accountability in the process of exchange. So I wanted non-exchangeable, singular moments of value. And I wanted to think about what it was to produce those in a way that wasn't just, rich people on cruise ships declaring themselves sovereign citizens. Like freedom it's just been shit on by the worst human beings on the planet. And so if, I wanted to find some version of it that didn't feel like, Bitcoin.
So Harney and Moten refer to this dynamic as experimentation with the general antagonism. So this kind of reading group as a mode of study, and they refer to this as sort of, this experimentation, and they call it a riotous production of difference.
Yeah.
So our final question for you is about this production of difference. And your book, to come back to your book, Savage Ecology, it ends with a meditation on the question of apocalypse in the future. And you develop a notion of feral reason as an affirmation of difference within catastrophe. And feral is not a way out of apocalypse, but rather a way through it. And you write, what comes next is an effort to build capacities and intensities attuned to novelty that can remain political while also finding satisfaction and even inspiration in whatever comes next. Could you elaborate on this dynamic between apocalypse, difference, world, and feral reason, particularly as ways of thinking about the future? I'll
do my best. I think Harney and Moten's is more noble than mine. I love the undercommons. When I found the undercommons, I was like, thank you, previously called Jesus. It felt good to hear other people finding joy in the university without having to create a new field of study. The saddest thing that'll ever happen is when somebody gets the grant for a department.
Studies. That's inevitable, I think. Joy studies. Yeah.
Yeah, or undercommon studies.
Right,
like,
right, right. Better,
like there'll be an anthropologist who's like, well, I've gone and I've surveyed all the undercommons. And here's what I find is the common characteristic in the creation of heterotopic spaces in asynchronous time. No dig on anthropologists. It could have just easily been sociologists. But, I think for me, they're right in that it's always fugitive. And I think that's what I was trying to account for with feral. There's a tendency in deep ecology and a lot of ecological thinking which wants to think about the feral, which is anti-human in a way that's not interesting to me, in the sense that it has a kind of antipathy towards the human rather than a desire for novelty. And what is for me inspirational, particularly about Moten, like you read Black and Blur, there's nothing but inspiration there. There's antagonism, but there's no misanthropism, right? Like the misanthropy is not, there's no ressentiment, right? Right, in that sort of Nietzschean sense. And so similarly, I wanted feral to still bear a certain fidelity to reason. I don't think that reason is uninteresting. I just don't think it should be dominant. And so, I want to think about how to cultivate thinking as something which isn't rarefied or reified. That is something that's constantly practiced, which even is something you might want to get good at, but isn't something you'd want to be professional at. And I think that line, and I think the whole book is probably an experiment in this, because what the hell am I an expert in? But like that sort of line between amateurism and dilettantism is actually one that is only marginalized because we live in an era in which expertise has to be monetized. Being pretty good at a lot of things is actually great. And like experimenting with a lot of different things is like actually how you find new things and the joy that comes from finding new things. And I don't think that there's an apocalypse that can make that impossible. And so for me, I would rather people be stockpiling techniques for living with new differences and singularities than stockpiling canned goods and natural gas to make it through the next Texas snowpocalypse. And that's what I meant by feral reason, which is a way of holding on to the value of what I think is both the worst and best part of the origin of the university, right? Which is this pursuit of knowledge, this love of knowledge, at the expense of the practicality of the world. And there are ways in which that became an awful thing, right? Land grant schools are also settler colonial flagships. But there's also ways in which that became a beautiful thing, right? Where poetry happened and knowledge was saved by, raiding awful people, and, weird spaces were created for people to become something different than they were meant to be. And so, I think feral reason for me is a kind of pedagogical demand on not what a new university could be, but what we should be looking for to hold on to in universities. Because like we're always going to be doing things with two hands, right? That's part of Moten and Harney's point. Like we're always going to be holding the deans at bay. That's just I don't think that there's an end to that. I do think it's better when we're the deans. I do think it's better like when there isn't a separate class of administrators and it rotates. Like I can think about more democratic ways to do it for sure, but still there will be this managerial urge in the formation of a university. But at the same time, as we like find better ways to sustain that and fend it off, we also have to find better places to hide from it and like recharge and find new things. And there is a bit of, I don't know how to say it, and I don't want to overstate it because I don't want to sound like Mark Lillo, but there is at times a kind of anti-intellectualism in the critique of the university. Like a kind of rejection of theory on the grounds that theory is a certain kind of power move. And of course it was, because what isn't? But it's also been this like moments of eruptive creativity, inspiration, and so, in the whole book, I want to try to hold on to both of those things at the same time. I don't want to either excuse or let go of, right? And I think that's a hard thing to do, but that's what I'm trying to do in that end is Like, how can we think about more kinds of experiments? And, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, why didn't you talk about all the cool things indigenous people are doing? Or why didn't you detail all these other places where it's happening? And, you know, I think my answer is for the same reason, like I didn't join up to be an anthropologist in Iraq. I want to maybe, like, if I'm really lucky, I'll inspire some of those things. If I'm even luckier, people will invite me into some of those things. And the last thing I want to do is leave behind a detailed diagram of how to target them and destroy them and take them to pieces. And I do think theory has this really really unhelpful theory, inspirational but unhelpful theory, walks this really interesting line of being able to provide sustenance without providing a map where to find us. And I think that's really important. And I think we have to be really careful of that. One of the things about fetishizing resistance in the form of detailed elaborations of exactly how it took place and where it took place and who the actors were, although their names have been changed to protect the innocent, is that you're doing counterinsurgency, even if you don't want to. And I think theory is one of these weird places where we get to be ambivalently legible. And we get to play with that legibility. And of course, some people will figure it out. You know, of course, people have used 1,000 plateaus in war because they've used everything in war.
Doesn't the IDF, or hadn't they at some point read 1,000 plateaus?
It's a funny story. The Brigadier General Nevy, who used 1,000 plateaus, lost his job. But currently runs a consultant.
Maybe it didn't have quite the exact effect that he wanted it to. Maybe,
but they run the hottest consultant.
From it.
Yeah, they run the hottest consultancy in DC with Petraeus and Kilcullen. So Kilcullen, Neve, and Petraeus all run this like weird POMO counterinsurgency private organization in DC. So yeah, I mean, all that stuff can go badly, but you know, like that, yeah. So, you know, I want to create a space where we ought not feel a sense of guilt for trying to have fun with ideas.
I think that's a beautiful moment to wrap what has been a truly fascinating conversation. And we want to thank you again so much for joining us today to have this conversation. And hopefully we can do it again too at some point in the future.
Yeah, well, thanks for creating a space for ideas.